I smoothed the satin folds of my navy dress, the one my granddaughter had begged me to wear, saying it made me look regal. The mirror reflected a woman both proud and trembling, a grandmother stepping into a day she'd waited her whole life to see. Weddings carry the weight of hope, and tonight, I wanted to believe in second chances too, though I told myself those belonged only to the young. Before I go on, this is just the beginning of our story about love and time. Tell me where you are watching from. The church bells rang, each note tugging at my heart. Families filled the pews with laughter, roses perfumed the air, and my granddaughter's veil shimmered like a promise. I should have been wholly present in her joy. But then I saw him. Across the aisle, his hair silver now, his shoulders bent with years, yet his eyes still carrying the same spark. My first love, standing among the guests, shattering decades of silence with nothing more than his presence. So let's get into what happened after I saw him standing there, a figure pulled straight out of the past. My heart stumbled in my chest as though it had forgotten its rhythm. The air around me felt heavier, filled not with the scent of roses anymore, but with the weight of memories pressing against me. I gripped the pew in front of me, my fingers digging into the polished wood, afraid I might fall if I didn't hold on. It wasn't possible, I told myself. He couldn't be here. After all these years, after all that silence, what reason would he have to step into this church on this particular day? Yet my eyes refused to look away. He was older, yes, but there was no mistaking him. The years had left their mark, but his gaze carried that familiar steadiness I remembered from when we were both young, when the world felt like it could bend to our dreams. I tried to keep my focus on my granddaughter as she made her way down the aisle, radiant and glowing in her white gown. But my vision blurred. Each step she took seemed to echo back to another aisle, another moment, when I had once stood in her place. And he had been there too, waiting at the edges of my life, holding promises we never managed to keep. Memories began to unravel inside me, uninvited. I saw myself at 18, standing under a summer sky, laughter spilling from my lips as he chased me through the fields behind my family's house. I remembered the smell of fresh-cut grass, the way he lifted me easily in his arms, and the quiet way he whispered that we had forever ahead of us. Back then, I believed it. Back then, forever felt certain. But life had other plans. Families intervened, responsibilities pulled, and love, no matter how fierce, wasn't enough to stand against duty. I had chosen stability over passion, security over risk, and for decades I convinced myself it was the right choice. Until now, seeing him, every certainty I had wrapped myself in began to loosen. He noticed me too. I saw it in the way his face shifted, as if he had been holding himself in place until that very instant. For a moment, the church, the vows, the crowd, they all fell away. It was just us. Two people separated by years, but tethered by something that time hadn't completely severed. I wanted to turn away, to pretend I hadn't seen him, but my body betrayed me. I sat rigid, my breath shallow, staring back as though caught in a mirror that reflected not who I was now, but who I had been then. My granddaughter's voice, trembling with joy as she recited her vows, finally pulled me out of it. I clung to her words, tried to anchor myself in her moment. Yet beneath it all, my mind was whispering questions I had buried for half a lifetime. Why was he here? Did he come to see me, or was it only coincidence? As the ceremony moved forward, I let my thoughts drift. I remembered the first time we met, at a town dance of all places. The hall smelled of waxed floors and cheap perfume, the band playing a tune just a little off-key. He had walked up to me with that same steady look, asking if I wanted to dance. I was shy, hesitant, but something about him made it easy to say yes. That dance lasted longer than the song, stretching into weeks of stolen moments and hushed conversations by the riverbank. We thought we could hold on forever, but my father had different ideas. He wanted me to marry someone safe, someone with a good job and a future that wasn't built on dreams. And so, little by little, the space between my first love and me grew. Letters went unanswered. Meetings became rarer. Until one day, he was gone from my daily life, and I carried on as though he had been nothing more than a sweet chapter. But deep down, I knew better. He had been the story I never finished. The priest's words broke through my thoughts, bringing me back to the present. My granddaughter's hand rested in her husband's, their faces bright with a love that felt untouched by fear or compromise. Watching them, I couldn't help but wonder what my life might have looked like had I been braver, had I chosen differently. And still, I felt his presence, steady and unshaken, across the church. Every time I dared to glance in his direction, his eyes were already on me. There was no malice there, no regret that I could read, just recognition. As if he too had carried me in his heart all these years, quietly, without words. When the ceremony ended and the guests rose to their feet, I stayed seated a little longer, gathering myself. I watched the young couple walk down the aisle, and I clapped with everyone else, but my hands trembled. I told myself I could leave it at that. Pretend I hadn't seen him, keep the past locked away where it belonged. Yet I knew, as surely as I knew my own name, that this was only the beginning. He was here, and somehow that meant the past was no longer finished. After the ceremony ended, I tried to convince myself that I could slip through the reception without crossing his path. It was a foolish hope, really, because weddings are not places for hiding. They are gatherings of faces, a circle that always closes in. As the guests began to flow toward the banquet hall, I walked slowly, letting others move ahead, praying the noise and laughter would shield me from the storm building inside my chest. The hall was bright with flowers, glasses clinking, and music spilling from the band. I focused on my granddaughter, who glowed with that untouchable happiness only new brides carry. Her joy should have been enough to anchor me, yet I found myself glancing across the room again and again, searching for him despite every reason not to. And then there he was, standing near the edge of the crowd with a drink in his hand, speaking quietly to someone I didn't recognize. My pulse stumbled the same way it had in the church. I told myself to stay put, to cling to the family around me. But as though guided by some unspoken thread, our eyes met across the hall. He didn't look away. Neither did I. It was my granddaughter's new husband who unknowingly pushed me toward him, introducing me to guests, moving us around the tables until, eventually, there he was, standing only a few feet from me. "Hello," he said. His voice was deeper than I remembered, worn by years but steady. That steadiness had always been his mark, even when we were young. I swallowed hard, unsure if I could match his calm. "Hello," I managed. Two simple words, yet they felt like the heaviest thing I had spoken in years. For a moment, neither of us said more. The music and chatter blurred into the background, the clinking of cutlery and laughter muffled as though we were sealed in a bubble. I thought of all the words I had imagined saying if I ever saw him again. None of them came. "You look well," he said at last. It was such a plain phrase, yet it pierced me. I wanted to tell him everything, that life had been full and hard and complicated, that I had found ways to be content, that sometimes in the quiet moments I still wondered about him. But all I said was, "And you?" A silence stretched between us, not uncomfortable, but weighted. I could feel the years pressing down, all the unspoken choices and roads not taken. I searched his face for answers, but all I saw was recognition, the quiet acknowledgement that we had once been everything to each other, and now we were two people trying to bridge a gap of decades. "Do you ever think back?" he asked softly, leaning closer so his words would not be carried off by the music. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Every now and then," I admitted. "Especially tonight." He gave a small nod as though my words confirmed something he already knew. "I never thought I'd see you again," he said. "And yet, here I am at your granddaughter's wedding of all places." I wanted to laugh or maybe cry, but instead I said, "Life has a strange way of circling back." Before either of us could say more, my daughter approached, pulling me toward another group of guests. I excused myself, heart pounding, but the look we shared as I walked away told me this wasn't finished. Later in the evening, after the speeches and the first dance, I found myself stepping outside for some air. The night was cooler, the noise of the reception muffled through the doors. And there he was again, leaning against the railing as though waiting. Or maybe I only hoped he was waiting. "I didn't mean to startle you back there," he said when he saw me. "You didn't," I replied, though it was a lie. He had startled me more than anyone ever could. We stood side by side for a moment, watching the lights from the hall spill across the lawn. The silence between us was different now, filled with a quiet recognition of what had been left unsaid for too long. "You know," he said, "I always wondered if you were happy. That's what kept me up at night. Not the choices we made, but whether you found some kind of peace with them." I hesitated because the truth was complicated. "I had a good life," I said. "But there were times I asked myself the same thing about you." He smiled faintly, looking out at the dark. "I got by. But you were never far from my mind. Isn't that something? Decades gone, and still, here we are." I felt something shift inside me then. It wasn't regret exactly, nor was it longing. It was the sharp awareness of how much our younger selves had given up, and how much of that sacrifice still lingered in both of us. We spoke little after that, not because there was nothing to say, but because so much had already been said without words. The band inside struck up another lively tune, and I thought of my granddaughter, dancing, wrapped in the kind of love that had survived its first bloom. When I finally turned back toward the hall, he touched my arm lightly, just enough to stop me. "I'm glad I saw you again," he said. "So am I whispered. And I meant it, even if the ache of it would follow me home. When I returned to the reception, the music and laughter pressed in around me, but my mind wasn't there anymore. My body moved on instinct, smiling at relatives, nodding through conversations, lifting a glass when a toast was made. But my thoughts kept circling back to him, and to the years we had lost. I knew I couldn't make sense of this moment without going back to where it all began. The truth is, we met when I was only 17. It was one of those town dances everyone attended because there wasn't much else to do. My mother had pressed my hair into waves, my father had warned me not to get carried away, and I walked into that hall, thinking it would be like every other Saturday night. But then he was there, leaning against the wall with that quiet look of his, and when his eyes found mine, the room shifted. I didn't know it then, but that night would mark me for the rest of my life. He asked me to dance, and it was clumsy at first. My shoes squeaked on the wooden floor, his hand was warm but uncertain on my waist. Still, there was something about him that made me forget the awkwardness. We laughed when we stepped on each other's toes, and by the end of the song, I didn't want it to end. From that night on, he became a constant in my life. We'd meet by the river in the evenings where the sound of crickets filled the silence between our words. He told me about his plans, how he wanted to travel, to make something of himself outside the small boundaries of our town. I told him about my dreams too, though mine were smaller. I wanted a family, a home filled with laughter, and maybe just a bit of freedom to be myself. Somehow we believed we could fold both our hopes into one future. Looking back, I can still remember the first time he told me he loved me. We were sitting on the hood of his old car, the summer air thick with heat, and he looked at me as though the rest of the world didn't exist. His words weren't dramatic or rehearsed. They slipped out naturally, like a truth he had carried for a while. I said it back without hesitation, and for a moment, everything felt possible. But life, as I learned, has a way of setting limits we never see coming. My father didn't approve. He thought my first love was too ambitious, too reckless, not steady enough to build a life with. He wanted me to marry someone safer, someone who had already proven himself. At the time, I thought I could fight it. I believed our love was strong enough to change his mind. But fathers in those days had more authority than daughters, and slowly the walls closed in. The arguments at home grew sharper. My father reminded me of everything he had done for me, the sacrifices he had made, and how marrying wisely was the least I owed in return. My mother, quieter but firm, urged me to listen. I was torn between the boy who made me feel alive and the family who raised me. I told myself it was only a matter of time, that maybe he and I could run away, build something without their approval. But when the moment came to choose, I faltered. I can still see the day I ended it. We met by the river again, and I told him I couldn't fight my family anymore. His jaw tightened, his hands balled into fists. But he didn't beg. He only looked at me for a long while, then nodded. That was who he was. Steady, even in heartbreak. He kissed my forehead, whispered that he wished things were different, and walked away. For years afterward, I carried that moment like a stone in my pocket. I moved on, of course. I married the man my father chose. He was kind enough, dependable in ways my family valued. We built a life together, raised children, and I poured myself into making the best of it. But every once in a while, in the quiet of the night, I would think back to the river, to the car rides, to the boy who had once promised me forever. Standing in that wedding hall decades later, those memories came rushing back with such force that I felt myself sway. It wasn't that I regretted my life. My children, my grandchildren, the years of stability all had meaning. But seeing him again made me realize how much of myself I had packed away, how many parts of me had gone silent just to survive the choices I made. He was across the room again, speaking to a cousin of mine who clearly hadn't pieced together who he was to me. I wondered if she could see the undercurrent between us, or if it was invisible to everyone but me. To the rest of the world, he was just another guest at a wedding. To me, he was the chapter that had never been closed, the thread I had once dropped but never cut. As the evening went on, I tried to bury myself in the joy of the day. I danced with my granddaughter, hugged relatives, accepted compliments about how proud I must feel. But every song, every laugh felt layered with the shadow of what could have been. My granddaughter's smile reminded me of my own at her age, and I silently prayed she would never face the same choice I had, that she would hold on to her love no matter what anyone said. Later, as the crowd grew livelier and the wine loosened everyone's tongues, I slipped into a corner to gather myself. It was then that I realized he was walking toward me. Each step he took seemed to pull the air tighter around me, and when he finally stopped in front of me, I couldn't look away. "We were so young," he said quietly. His voice carried no blame, only remembrance. "Yes," I whispered, my throat dry. "We were." In that moment, I knew the past had found me again, and no amount of pretending could push it away. So when he finally stood in front of me, the years that had stretched between us seemed to fold into nothing. The reception noise faded until all I could hear was my own breath. He looked at me steadily, waiting as though he knew I had questions that had never found their way out. "You disappeared," I said before I could stop myself. The words came out sharper than I intended, heavy with all the nights I had wondered where he went after I ended things by the river. He didn't flinch. "I left town," he said. "I thought it would make it easier for both of us if I wasn't around. Every street, every familiar corner, it all reminded me of you. I couldn't live like that." I studied his face. The lines etched there told their own story, years carved into skin. He wasn't blaming me, but he wasn't softening the truth either. He had loved me enough to leave rather than haunt me with what I couldn't have. "You didn't write," I whispered. "I did," he answered quietly. "Once or twice. But your father made it clear the letters weren't welcome." So I stopped. After that, I told myself it was best to let you live the life you'd chosen. The words cut through me like glass. I thought back to those long months when I waited for a letter that never came. My father had told me it was time to move on, and I believed him. Now, I wondered how many pages had been kept from me, how much had been silenced before I ever had the chance to read it. "I never knew," I said, my throat tightening. "I figured as much," he replied. His gaze softened then, and he added, "I don't blame you." We were kids caught in the pull of other people's plans. Neither of us had the power to change it. Still, I couldn't help the ache rising inside me. I thought you forgot me. He shook his head. Number, I carried you with me, always. But I had to find a way to live. I worked, moved from place to place, built something steady enough to stand on. And yet, here I am, standing in front of you, and it feels like no time has passed at all. We stood there in silence for a while, two people suspended between past and present. Inside, the band shifted to a softer tune, couples swaying across the floor. My granddaughter's laughter carried across the hall, bright and free. Watching her reminded me of us when we were young, before the world pushed in. Did you marry? I asked, breaking the silence. I did, he said after a pause. She was good to me. We had years together, raised children. She passed some time ago. His voice caught slightly, not with grief, but with the weight of memory. I won't pretend it was the same, but it was a life I don't regret. I nodded, absorbing the truth of it. He had lived just as I had, with choices that carved us into different people. And you, he asked, though I could tell he already knew the answer. I married who my father chose, I admitted. We had children, a house, the kind of stability everyone said mattered most. It wasn't unhappy. But some days I wondered what it might have been like if I'd been braver. Our eyes met again, and in that look I felt everything. The weight of years, the pull of lost chances, the strange comfort of knowing he still understood me in ways no one else had. He leaned a little closer. Maybe bravery looks different for each of us. You built a family. You stood by them. That takes its own kind of courage. His words landed heavier than he knew. For so long I had thought of myself as weak for letting him go, for bowing to my father's will. But in his eyes, I saw another version of myself. A woman who had done what she thought necessary to protect her family, even at the cost of her own heart. The moment was broken by my granddaughter rushing past, pulling me into a hug, her veil brushing my cheek. "Grandma, aren't you happy?" She beamed. I forced a smile and squeezed her tight. "More than you know," I said, though my voice carried more layers than she could possibly understand. When she darted off again, I turned back to him. "She reminds me of us," I said softly. "She does," he agreed. "And maybe she'll write her own story without the interference we faced." Something in me shifted then, a quiet release of the bitterness I had carried for so long. We couldn't rewrite the past, but perhaps we could honor it, not as a wound, but as a chapter that shaped us both. As the night wore on, we didn't say much more. Sometimes words only get in the way. We sat near each other, watching the dance floor, sharing glances that spoke more than sentences ever could. And for the first time in decades, I didn't feel haunted by what we had lost. I felt strangely grateful for having known it at all, so as the night stretched on, I kept thinking this might be the last time I saw him. The thought pressed on me with surprising force. I told myself we had said enough, that seeing him was closure, that I could walk away now with a kind of peace. But the truth was, I wasn't ready to let the thread snap a second time without holding it a little longer. The reception began to thin out. Guests drifted toward the exits, shoes in hand, jackets draped over shoulders. The young couple slipped away to take more photographs, their laughter echoing down the hall. I stayed seated near the edge of the dance floor, pretending to adjust my shawl, but really I was waiting to see if he would come closer again, waiting to know if he still felt the same pull I did. He did. He walked toward me slowly, as though careful not to intrude, and when he stopped beside me, he asked if I wanted some air. I nodded, grateful for the excuse to escape the watchful eyes of family who might notice more than I was ready to explain. Outside, the night was cool and quiet. The music from the hall floated faintly through the doors, softened by distance. We walked along the path leading away from the noise, the gravel crunching beneath our steps. For a while we didn't talk, and that silence felt almost comforting, like slipping back into something we had known long ago. Finally, he said, "Do you ever think about how things might have gone if we had fought harder?" His question stopped me in my tracks. I stared at the shadows of trees swaying above us, then back at him. All the time, I admitted. But I also wonder if we would have survived it. We were young and the world expected so much from us. Maybe love wasn't enough to carry it. He shook his head. Maybe. Or maybe it would have been. I'll never know. There was no bitterness in his tone, only a kind of weary acceptance. That steadiness of his was still there, the same quality that once made me trust him without question. I found myself studying his face in the dim light, noticing the changes the years had carved, but also the way some things had not shifted at all. I built my life as best I could, I said after a pause. I don't regret my family or the years I spent with them. But sometimes I regret the girl who gave up so easily. He glanced at me. You didn't give up easily. You were put in an impossible position. There's a difference. We walked a little further and I let his words settle. Maybe he was right. Maybe I had been too harsh on myself all these years. After a while, he asked, "Would you like to meet for coffee sometime?" Just to talk, away from all this. The question startled me, though part of me had been hoping for it. Coffee. Such an ordinary thing, and yet it felt enormous. I don't know if that's a good idea, I said carefully. Why not? He asked, not pushing, but waiting. Because it might stir up things best left alone, I answered. He nodded slowly. Maybe. Or maybe it gives us a chance to finally lay them to rest. I didn't answer right away. I thought about my children, my granddaughter, the family that knew me as one version of myself, the steady grandmother who never broke the rules, who carried on quietly. They didn't know this part of me, the part that still remembered the girl under the summer sky. I'll think about it, I said finally. He accepted that without argument. We walked back toward the hall, and when we reached the doorway, he touched my arm lightly, the briefest brush of connection. Whatever you decide, I'm glad we spoke tonight, he said. Inside, the reception was winding down. Chairs pushed back, plates cleared, the last of the music fading. I slipped into the crowd again, but the weight on my chest had shifted. It wasn't just longing anymore. It was the knowledge that I had a choice. For the first time in decades, I could decide for myself whether to keep the past closed or to open it just enough to breathe. Later that night, when I returned home, I sat on the edge of my bed and let the quiet settle around me. My shawl still carried the faint smell of roses from the hall. I thought about him, about his words, his steady presence, the possibility of coffee. My heart ached with both fear and something I hadn't felt in a long time. Anticipation. I didn't know yet what I would choose. But I knew one thing for certain. His return had awakened something in me I thought was gone forever. And whether I met him again or not, I would never see myself or my past the same way again. So in the days after the wedding, I found myself carrying his presence with me like a shadow. I'd go about my routines, watering the plants, folding laundry, cooking for myself, and yet every task was interrupted by the thought of him asking if I would meet him for coffee. I wanted to push the idea aside, tell myself it was easier to leave things where they were, but I couldn't. The question lingered, soft but insistent, like a knock I hadn't answered. I didn't speak of it to anyone. My children called to ask how I was doing after the excitement of the wedding, and I gave them the usual answers. It was wonderful. She looked so beautiful. I'm tired but happy. None of them knew that beneath those words was a turmoil I hadn't felt in years. I wondered if that was selfish of me, to carry this secret like a treasure and a burden all at once. At night, sleep came in fits. I would drift off only to wake with a start, thinking about the river where we used to meet, the sound of his voice when he said my name. Memories I thought had faded, completely were sharp again. It unsettled me, but it also reminded me that I was still alive in ways I had nearly forgotten. 3 days after the wedding, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and stared at my phone. I had his number, passed along through a cousin who remembered him from long ago. It sat there, written on a scrap of paper beside me, daring me to use it. I picked it up and set it down 3 times before finally dialing. He answered on the second ring. His voice was calm, as if he had expected me. "I was wondering when I'd hear from you," he said. I laughed nervously. I wasn't sure if I should call. "I'm glad you did," he replied. Then gently, "Would you like to meet?" We chose a small cafe in town, the kind of place where people lingered without hurry. The morning of, I almost didn't go. I stood in front of my closet trying to decide what to wear, feeling ridiculous for caring so much. But it mattered. It mattered because it had been decades since I had cared about being seen through his eyes. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting by the window with a cup in front of him. For a moment, I paused outside watching him. His hair was thinner, his shoulders less straight than they once were, but something in his posture was familiar. It steadied me enough to push open the door. He stood when he saw me. "You came," he said, his eyes lighting just a little. "I did," I replied, slipping into the chair across from him. The first few minutes were filled with the ordinary things. Asking about his children, telling him about mine, sharing the broad strokes of the lives we had lived. But slowly the conversation shifted. We began filling in the details, the cracks that had been left open since we were young. I kept thinking of the letters, I admitted. The ones I never got. He nodded. "I wrote more than 2. Your father sent them back, unopened. I knew then it was a wall I couldn't break." I closed my eyes briefly, anger bubbling up, even after all this time. He thought he was protecting me, but he took away my choice. He believed he was doing what was best, he said gently. I can't fault him for that, but it doesn't change what it cost us. We let the silence settle for a moment. It wasn't the silence of strangers, it was the silence of people who had once known each other so well that words weren't always needed. "Do you ever wish we'd tried harder?" I asked finally. Every day," he said without hesitation. "But I also know we can't rewrite it now. What we can do is decide what these years left us with. Regret or gratitude." His words sank deep. For so long I had chosen regret, letting it whisper to me in the quiet corners of my life. Gratitude felt harder, but maybe it was the only way forward. We stayed in that cafe for hours, speaking of everything and nothing. We remembered the summers, the car rides, the way the world had felt wide open when we were young. And then we talked about the years apart. His work, my family, the milestones we missed in each other's lives. It was both comforting and strange, like stitching together 2 pieces of fabric that had once belonged to the same cloth. When we finally stood to leave, he walked me to my car. For a moment, we lingered there, neither of us ready to say goodbye. "I don't know what this is," I said honestly. "I don't know if it's meant to be more than a meeting, or if it's just closure." Oh, he smiled faintly. "Maybe it doesn't have to be either. Maybe it's simply 2 old friends remembering what it means to be seen." I carried those words with me as I drove home. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I knew I felt lighter than I had in years. The past wasn't gone, it had found me again. But instead of breaking me, it was giving me the chance to understand myself in a new way. So, in the weeks after that coffee, I realized his return had stirred more than just memories. It had forced me to confront the woman I had become. For so long, I had lived as though my past was sealed away, a chapter I wasn't allowed to open. But now, every morning when I looked in the mirror, I saw not only a grandmother, not only a mother, but also the young girl who had once believed she could shape her own future. I didn't rush into decisions. Instead, I carried on with my life. Grocery shopping, meeting friends, attending church. Yet beneath the rhythm of my days, there was a new awareness, a quiet energy reminding me that I was still more than the roles I had played. I thought about him often, but not with the ache I once carried. It was different now, less about regret and more about recognition. One evening, my granddaughter came over. She wanted to talk about her honeymoon, her plans for the future. As she sat at my kitchen table, glowing with excitement, I found myself studying her, remembering how I had once been that age, full of dreams. I listened to her speak, and then I surprised myself by saying, "Promise me something. Promise me that when the world tells you to give up on what you love, you'll hold on tighter." She looked at me curiously, perhaps sensing the weight behind my words. "I promise, Grandma," she said, reaching for my hand. In that moment, I realized the true gift of his return wasn't about rekindling romance. It was about reclaiming the parts of myself I had set aside and passing that strength on to the next generation. Not long after, he and I met again, this time at a park we both remembered from our youth. We walked slowly, stopping at benches, talking about everything from our families to the aches in our knees. There was no urgency, no desperation to rewrite history. There was only an ease that came from acceptance. "I used to think our story ended too soon," I told him. "And now?" he asked. "Now I think it ended when it needed to," I said. "And maybe it began again exactly when it was meant to." He nodded, not arguing, not pressing for more. That was one of the things I had always loved about him. He didn't try to fill the silence with answers. When I returned home that day, I sat down with a notebook and began writing. Not a letter, not a diary entry, but a story. Our story. I wrote about the girl I had been, the choices I made, the cost of them, and the grace of this unexpected reunion. I didn't know if anyone else would ever read it, but I needed to put it down, to honor it as part of my life rather than a shadow I hid from. Weeks turned into months, and our meetings became a quiet rhythm. Sometimes coffee, sometimes walks, sometimes just phone calls to share the details of our days. It wasn't about reclaiming youth, it was about companionship, understanding, and the rare gift of being known so deeply, even after decades apart. I never kept it a secret from my family, though I introduced it gently. My children were surprised at first, puzzled even, but they saw the lightness in me, the way I carried myself differently. My granddaughter especially understood. One afternoon, she hugged me and said, "I'm glad you have this. You deserve it." Her words stayed with me because for years I never thought about what I deserved. I thought only about duty, responsibility, what was expected. But now, near the end of my life's long journey, I realized that deserving didn't mean selfishness. It meant acknowledging my own heart had value too. I don't know how much time we'll have together. None of us can know. But I do know this. When my first love walked into my granddaughter's wedding, he didn't just return to me. He returned a piece of myself I'd long thought was gone. And maybe that's what life is in the end. Not perfect choices, not neat endings, but moments of grace that come when we least expect them. Moments that remind us who we are and who we have always been beneath the years. Yet, if this story spoke to you, wait until you hear what happened when a woman discovered her husband had planted a hidden camera in her own room. She didn't stay silent. She brought the footage straight to the judge. Watch that true story next. You won't forget it.